Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Castlevania, originally released for the Nintendo Entertainment System, or Famicom if you're talking about the Japanese version, but it was later re-released on numerous systems over the years. What you're seeing here is the Castlevania Anniversary Collection version, which is on PC, and you'll actually be seeing footage of both the American version of the game and the Japanese version of the game, because that collection I mentioned actually does contain both. This is an action platformer by Konami that was originally released in 1986 for Famicom and saw release on NES the following year, and of course it's been re-released numerous times since then. At the time of its release, it was generally very well received across the board, and it sold very well on top of that, which then spawned the now legendary Castlevania franchise. Of course, there would be additional sequels on the NES and Famicom, but some variant or another of the Castlevania series has seen release on every major gaming system that has released since the NES and Famicom. And I would say that whether you like this style of game or not, most gamers out there have been exposed to at least one entry in the Castlevania series at some point. Whether that be one of the classic style of Castlevania games, like of course the ones on the NES, or even up to Castlevania Bloodlines, or say the Metroidvania style like in Symphony of the Night, or the later entries that went up until basically the series went 3D, or maybe you were introduced in Castlevania 64, or Lament of Innocence, or any number of other entries in the series that may be wildly different from this, but the series did have to get its start somewhere, and that's what we'll be taking a look at today. But before I start delving into this, I do need to mention two things. The first of which is that I am absolute garbage at platformers, and that will probably show in the footage here. In fact, the only way I was actually able to finish this game was playing the Japanese version, which has an easy mode. You can laugh at me all you like, I frankly don't care. I know I'm terrible at platformers and nothing's gonna change that. It's one of the major reasons I never really got anything out of the genre to begin with, but I can set that aside. The second thing I need to mention is that I'm actually not blinded by nostalgia on this one, because I actually didn't play the original Castlevania back in the day. I never had an NES. I went straight from Atari 2600 to the Sega Genesis, which means that the first Castlevania game I actually played was Bloodlines. For those of you in the PAL region, that would mean Sega Mega Drive and Castlevania the New Generation. So while I'm certainly no stranger to the classic Castlevania formula, going back to something this raw and primitive was definitely an interesting experience. So let's actually go ahead and start delving right into this and find out what exactly we're dealing with here, and of course how well it still holds up. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, where there's really not a huge amount to talk about here. I mean, you gotta keep in mind this was released on the NES and the Famicom. It was released in 1986, so it's obviously gonna look extremely dated by modern standards. But here's the interesting thing about these classic 8-bit games. They've aged surprisingly well, all things considered. And Castlevania is really no exception in that regard. I mean, sure, it's an 8-bit game, but you can tell what everything you're looking at is. It's detailed enough to where there's almost never any question as to what you're looking at actually is. I mean, you can tell that it's a Medusa head, you can tell that it's a skeleton, or it's some sort of knight or animated armor, or it's a Frankenstein monster, or something along those lines. There's a couple of enemies here and there that you'll look at and you'll be like, what is that? And you're not entirely sure, but that's something that's more due to the limited capabilities of the NES than anything else. And speaking of limited capabilities, that is one of the things that does negatively impact the graphics, specifically with regards to the color scheme. Now, this is not necessarily a problem exclusive to Castlevania. A lot of NES games had this problem, where the color schemes just get really wonky all the time. It has to do with the way that the NES actually processes the color palettes and the way its graphics actually work, which of course is a topic that is way beyond the scope for a Castlevania review, and frankly I'm just not that well equipped to explain it to begin with. That's not really my realm of expertise. But suffice to say, what you end up with here is a rather limited color palette, and it does show when you actually go into the stages themselves, because while the actual artwork and the sprite work itself is actually quite good, the color schemes that they have applied to several of the stages just make all of that actually pretty irritating on the eyes. On top of this, there's an issue specific to the NES platform that you'll see on numerous games, but especially in something like Castlevania, where a lot of the sprites will actually flicker in and out. And again, I'm not entirely sure what causes it. I know it's something to do with the way that the NES processes graphics, but that does actually get kind of annoying after a while. But none of the issues with the visuals are ever insurmountable. insurmountable. You can get used to them after a while, although the eye strain may be something where you need to just step away from the screen every once in a while. But what you'll never really need to worry about is the sound design, because sure, it's 8-bit and thus rather primitive sound and music, but you've got some really catchy tunes in here, the most notable of course being what would eventually be known as Vampire Killer, which is of course the Stage 1 theme and has become one of the most iconic tracks in the entire Castlevania series. But while that definitely overshadows the rest of the soundtrack, there's really not a bad track anywhere on the soundtrack for this, so they definitely did a great job with that. And the sound effects themselves are about as good as you could hope for in an 8-bit game. They're definitely not amazing by any stretch of the imagination, but they get the job done, and they get it done pretty well. And when you bring all of the presentation together, you find that while it has aged reasonably well as far as NES games go, it is still a game from the 8-bit era, and those are still something of an acquired taste if you're going into it from a more modern perspective. So whether or not you'll be able to enjoy the visuals and sound, or simply have to put up with them in order to get to the rest of the game, is going to vary wildly from individual to individual. But really what's going to make or break this thing for you are the story, or rather lack thereof, and the gameplay. You see, the story is not much more than just basic setup for what you're ultimately going to be doing, and the idea is that you play as a guy named Simon Belmont, who enters the evil Count Dracula's castle, known as Castlevania, in order to take down Dracula himself and of course cleanse the land of evil. And that's pretty much it. There's really not a whole lot going on in terms of the story here, so it really does fall to the gameplay to bring things up, which is pretty par for the course for games of the era, let's be fair. So what exactly is on offer here? Well, it is a very basic action platformer, and it is the progenitor of the entire Castlevania series gameplay style. This means that you have a button for jump, and you have a button for your main attack, which in this case is a whip. And the basic gameplay consists of jumping from platform to platform, defeating enemies until eventually you get to the end of a stage, and you have to fight a boss enemy which has its own health bar, and once you deplete that health bar, it drops an orb that you can pick up to, of course, score that particular stage, and then move on to the next stage. There are a variety of items that you can find by either whipping the candelabras or defeating enemies, and those consist of either sub-weapons, which are either the dagger, which is just throwing a dagger at enemies in a single straight line, or the axe, which you throw at an upwards angle, or the stopwatch, which briefly freezes all enemies on screen, the cross, which functions as a boomerang that you throw out in a straight line that comes back and also does damage on the way back, and last but not least, the holy water, which you throw on the ground and it bursts into flame, which will damage enemies that are caught within its radius as long as that flame is burning. You can only throw out one sub-weapon at a time, and it has to disappear from the screen before you can throw the next one, unless you have the power-up, which will give you either double or triple attack, where you can throw either 2 or 3 on screen at the same time. This is of course with the exception of the stopwatch, which wouldn't benefit from that to begin with, so instead when you pick up the 2 or 3 block when you have the stopwatch equipped, it'll just give you a bunch of points. Now, to use any of your sub-weapons, you have to have ammunition for them, and in this particular case, the ammunition is hearts. It's a bit of an odd choice for ammunition, but that's what they chose for this particular game, and you can find hearts by either whipping the candelabras or defeating enemies, and they come in 2 varieties. Single hearts, which lightly float to the ground, and large hearts, which count for 5, and which drop very quickly, so you have to be very careful not to let those drop through the ground. And if you don't use up all your hearts by the end of a stage, then it will actually count all of those for score when you actually finish a stage and collect the orb, which also of course replenishes your health and resets your heart count to 0 for the next stage. The other items you can find are a potion that gives you a very brief period where you can actually walk straight through enemies without taking damage, as well as a rosary that instantly destroys every enemy on screen when you pick it up, an upgrade item for your whip which you can collect twice, the first time of course just increasing your damage, and the second time increasing both your damage and the length of the whip, which of course allows you to hit enemies from further away, and some point items that are just sacks of money. In addition to bragging rights, the points also eventually give you 1-ups once you hit certain thresholds, so they're actually good to collect, since you will probably need those 1-ups quite badly. You see, since the interactions that you can actually have in the game are rather limited, those being you can move left or right, you can jump, you can duck by pressing down on the D-pad, and you can also press up on the D-pad and the attack button in order to use your sub-weapon, it means that any challenges in the game are also going going to be fairly simple to defeat, at least in theory. This means that the vast majority of the time you're just going to be fighting enemies that will do damage if they walk into you, or if they hit you with one of their projectile attacks, which you ordinarily can dodge or deal with by hitting them with the whip, all while trying to avoid instant death pits by jumping from platform to platform. If you do manage to die either by just taking too much damage from enemies or by falling into an instant death pit, then you lose a life and you spawn at the beginning of the section you were just on, without any of your whip upgrades, without your sub-weapon, and with all of your hearts depleted. Obviously that's a pretty hefty penalty, so you'll want to stay alive as long as you can, and to that end, if you're just taking damage from enemies, then sometimes you can find healing items scattered around the levels, which take the form of pork chops, and those will replenish a portion of your health, but it really behooves you simply to avoid getting hit at all, either by just dodging enemies or by defeating them before they get anywhere near you. Of course, you'll be wanting to do that anyway, because if you get hit and you're playing on either the normal difficulty on the Japanese version or just the only difficulty on the Western version of the game, then whenever you get hit, you actually get knocked back. Which means that if you get hit and you were jumping over an instant death pit, well, guess what? Now you've fallen into the instant death pit, and now you gotta start the section over. This becomes a boundless source of frustration if you're playing through on normal difficulty, or of course just the Western version of the game, but if you're playing the Japanese version's easy mode, then you actually don't get knocked back when you get hit. You still take the damage, of course, but you don't get knocked back, which means that it doesn't mess up your jumps. Which of course relegates the Medusa heads from being outright infuriating like they are in the normal difficulty or the Western version, down to just being really annoying like they are in the easy mode on the Japanese version. Now of course that's not to say that the easy mode on the Japanese version is a complete cakewalk. You still have to make all the jumps, you still have to fight all the enemies, it's just that you take slightly less damage per hit and you don't get knocked back. And you also start with a supply of 30 hearts as opposed to having none at all, and you also start with more lives. Why they didn't include this in the Western release, I have absolutely no idea, but the Western release only has one difficulty mode where you start with 3 lives, no hearts, and you get knocked back every single time you get hit. And again, that becomes incredibly frustrating incredibly quickly. This is very much an old-school action platformer, and thus it operates on arcade game principles, where the game itself is actually not very long. If you're not like me and you're actually good at platformers, then you'll find that you can go through the game probably in 25 to 30 minutes, because if you don't lose a single life, that's about how long it takes to finish the game. But obviously not everybody is good at platformers, and that's pretty much what arcade game principles are relying on in order to artificially lengthen the game. And that made perfect sense for arcades because you had to insert quarters to continue playing, and they wanted to make sure you were putting as much money in the machine as possible. Obviously, if you were good at the game, then you wouldn't need to insert as many quarters, but the people who weren't as good would need to keep putting in quarters to continue playing. The thing is, Castlevania is a home console game. There's no quarters to continue, so what you end up having instead is 3 continues, and once those are depleted, then you have to start the entire game over. And while that's pretty much par for the course for the period, unfortunately, because the difficulty is comprised entirely of cheap deaths, it just gets incredibly frustrating to actually try to play this thing on the normal difficulty. And while the incredibly cheap knockback deaths are not a thing on the easy difficulty if you're playing the Japanese version, it still has a lot of situations where it just throws enemies at you that are just cheaply designed. For example, the one corridor where it's throwing enemies at you that throw axes and take a large number of hits to bring down, while you're also fighting Medusa heads. Even if you're not affected by knockback, something like that is just still incredibly cheap and frustrating to go through, and that really just sums up Castlevania in a nutshell. It is an incredibly frustrating game precisely because every last bit of it is that cheap arcade game difficulty that we had come to expect from games of the 80s. And obviously back then we were used to arcade games, we were used to having cheap difficulty, and it didn't really bother us that much. But the operating words there are back then. You see, back in 1986 when this was released, that was perfectly acceptable, and frankly, by 1986 standards, Castlevania is absolutely brilliant. But it really has not aged very well at all. While it was certainly a great starting point for the franchise, it was very quickly eclipsed by other Castlevania games, most notably of course Castlevania 3 if you're going to stay on the same platform, And if you're going to include the next platform after this, then Super Castlevania 4 and Castlevania Bloodlines even make this look positively archaic by comparison. As such, the original Castlevania has effectively been relegated to not much more than a historical curiosity at this point. I mean, sure, people who played it back in the day will be very nostalgic for it, and they'll probably be able to still enjoy it, but if you've never played a Castlevania game before, or you have played Castlevanias, but it's only been stuff that's much more recent, like, say, since the SNES and Genesis era, or even more recent than that, then you're going to find the original Castlevania is extremely difficult to go back to. And unfortunately, that's just the case with a lot of older games in general. In the case of something like this, while it was fantastic in 1986, it really is a relic of its time, and as such, I have an extremely difficult time recommending anybody go back to it unless you actually played this back in the day. Thanks for watching.